Crash Bandicoot has a very strange legacy. The original PlayStation games were undeniably significant. Beyond serving to bolster the fledgling PlayStation, Naughty Dog's original Crash Bandicoot games were formative for many people, myself included. Looking back on those titles from where we are now, a gaming landscape filled with expansive open worlds and cinematics approaching the quality of live-action films, it probably seems ridiculous to some that a simple and goofy platformer like Crash Bandicoot could have been so important to so many people. A game whose main character looks like a bunch of orange pyramids glued together with some googly eyes stuck on for good measure. I think Crash's enduring legacy says a lot about the innate appeal of video games, an appeal which stretches back to the medium's earliest days. For as much as we obsess over graphics and scope, the mark of a good game is almost always a strong core gameplay loop. Whether it's Halo's signature 30 seconds of fun, or the simple act of moving Mario from one platform to the next, there's no getting around the fact that the gameplay loop is the game. This was true of games in 1996, and it's no less true now. But you know, some things do change. Following a string of releases of wildly disparate quality, the Crash Bandicoot series kinda just ended, and a lot changed while our favorite orange marsupial took his decade-long sabbatical. The stock market crashed, PSN crashed, and my computer crashed. That last one still keeps me up at night. During that decade, the discourse surrounding difficulty in video games became far more prominent, spurred in part by games which had garnered a reputation for being challenging. The genre of difficult games effectively came into existence, and with it came the question of whether difficulty was even an important component of video games. You might remember that it was a painfully insufferable conversation. I sure as shit do. Let me tell you what I don't remember. Crash Bandicoot having a reputation for being difficult. Yeah, the games were hard, but they weren't any more brutal than any other title released at the time. That's just how games were back then. Nevertheless, when Crash finally returned from his backpacking trip across Europe with the release of the Insane trilogy, the conversation surrounding his comeback was dominated by what I consider to be a very post-hoc view of the original games. A perspective further fueled by hack reviewers who had made a habit of comparing every moderately challenging game to Dark Souls. In retrospect, these shitty comparisons were really emblematic of the massive demographic shift the gaming scene had undergone since the late 90s. More people were playing video games, accessibility had become much more important, and the conversations surrounding video games had grown much louder thanks to the ubiquity of the internet. Crash Bandicoot had originally existed in a vastly different space, so when the Insane trilogy brought those titles back into the spotlight largely unchanged, it's not surprising that so many people who had never been exposed to the series considered those games to be unrelenting ball busters. That kind of reaction would surely influence the development of a hypothetical Crash Bandicoot 4, right? As would the remaster's overall reception among Crash fans. As would the inescapable reality that most people's expectations of this hypothetical Crash 4 would be drawn from their memories of the original adventures. And I doubt I need to explain how faulty the faculty of memory can sometimes be. When you really think about it, developing this hypothetical Crash Bandicoot 4 would be quite the daunting task. Well, Crash Bandicoot 4 is no longer a hypothetical game. Crash Bandicoot 4, It's About Time, is the first original Crash game since 2008. It was developed by Toys for Bob, the team behind Spyro Reignited trilogy, and serves as a direct sequel to Crash Bandicoot Warped, both in terms of its story and core gameplay. Virtually everything post PS1 Crash has been swept aside in favor of a surprisingly faithful sequel, which doesn't attempt to reinvent Crash, but simply nudge it forward with the aid of tighter controls, incredible visuals, and a handful of new gameplay elements. Crash 4 is a pretty good game, but is Crash Bandicoot 4 difficult? After I first completed Crash 4, this question coalesced in my head, and it grew louder and louder with each passing day. The memes must have really gotten to me. In all seriousness, answering this question became important to me, and I think that's because I eventually came to realize that Crash 4 could have turned out a lot worse than it did. Crafting a sequel to a string of relatively straightforward games seems like an easy task, but it almost certainly wasn't. Balancing the expectations of several groups of players while being constantly told that the old games were dated and in need of change would probably leave any developer utterly perplexed on how to proceed. Do you refrain from making any changes? That's untenable, right? I mean, is it? Or is that what people want? But you don't want to alienate new players, so how should you accommodate them? And how do you do that without compromising on difficulty? Crash is supposed to be hard, isn't it? Direct sequels to 22-year-old video games aren't exactly in large supply, meaning that despite the many similarities it bears to other platformers, Crash Bandicoot 4 is an incredibly unique game, and I wanted to really dig into it. So, I started up a second playthrough of Crash 4, not because I was looking for any excuse to avoid working on my book or exercise, but because I simply wanted to find an answer to my query. My goal with this analysis isn't to examine Crash 4 in its totality. I don't intend to discuss the game's visuals, music, or story, because I don't have much to say about those things. It's all good, save for the game's Terminator paradox of an ending, something which, really upsets me as an expert on Crash Bandicoot lore. I also don't intend to judge Crash 4 against previous games in the series. I don't really intend to compare this game to many other platformers at all. Instead, I'd like to examine how this game was designed, in which ways the game's challenges manifest, and fundamentally how well I believe this game was crafted, all in aid of ascertaining the answer to one simple question. How difficult is Crash Bandicoot 4? It's about time. I suppose, for the sake of the contemptuous Philistines who haven't played a Crash game before, we should start with a brief summary of what Crash Bandicoot is. Crash Bandicoot is an eastern barred bandicoot, which is a marsupial species native to Australia. He's not a rat. He's not a fox, Nathan, and sure, he may be a little slow, but that's not his fault. I may have misread that. Okay, so Crash Bandicoot 4 is a platformer which tasks players with reaching the end of a level. Yes, that sentence was profoundly insightful and definitely helpful. What's important to understand about Crash 4 is that it's a linear platformer, one which frequently shifts between 3D and 2D perspectives. There is a set procession of challenges, but also several optional challenges which, when successfully surmounted, yield collectibles such as gems and relics. Smashing the crates scattered throughout every level provide the player with Wumpa Fruit. Acquiring 100 Wumpa Fruit gives the player an additional life. Got it? Great. Let's get started. Crash 4, like virtually every platformer, is all about movement. The fun is derived from getting Crash over a pit, underneath the hazard, and through enemies. It follows then that Crash's movement mechanics are the base upon which the rest of the game is built, so let's start there. Crash is a very nimble character whose moveset is undeniably simplistic, being not much more complex than what's usually found in a standard 2D platformer. He can run, jump, double jump, spin, slide, slam, and crouch. In terms of chaining moves together, Crash can also slide jump, crouch jump, and slide spin, spin slide, slide swirl, shloop. Yeah, shloop. Crash can also shloop. Though it may seem like Crash has a lot of moves at his disposal, there's a certain inflexibility to the way that he can move through a level. There's only so much the gene-wearing marsupial can do, his most significant limitation being that he can't directly interact with the environment. He can't mount or leap off walls unless he's attached to a special object, such as a wall-running platform. He can't swim under any circumstances. He can't pick up or move objects. He can't slide down slopes. He can only interact with the world on its terms. One might think that's a bad thing, but it's not something I'd consider to be a problem, at least not necessarily. Terms like inflexible or restrictive come packaged with negative connotations, but all games have limitations. They're deliberate design choices which need to be considered with the game's broader context in mind. The only imposition I would place on any platformer is that the controls be responsive, and the controls in Crash 4 are extremely precise. Crash himself is far from sluggish to maneuver. He goes exactly where you need him to, and that's where the game expects you to send him. Crash Bandicoot 4, much like the games which came before it, doesn't task players with exploring the world as they see fit. Crash Bandicoot 4 is about surmounting a string of carefully constructed platforming challenges, and doing so largely in the way that the developers intended. If there were too many different moves at the player's disposal, there's a good chance that some of these challenges could be avoided outright. Perhaps most critically, since the game regularly employs perspective shifts, shifts, every single one of Crash's moves must translate well into 2D play spaces. Just as linearity isn't inherently bad, neither is simplicity. It's all about that pesky context, and when accounting for said context, Crash's somewhat limited moveset makes sense when considering how the levels are constructed, which we'll get to in a minute. Before we get there though, I gotta level with you. I was kinda trying to bamboozle you when I said that this game's movement is simplistic, because it's not quite that straightforward. I'm sure this revelation has left you feeling despondent, but that's a small price to pay for dramatic effect. You see, all of the elements of Crash's moveset that I just talked about are contingent on player input. But what about the aspects of his movement which aren't player directed? Well, allow me for a moment to direct your attention to one of the cartoons which inspired Crash Bandicoot. Coyote Time, based on the exploits of the feckless Wile E. Coyote, describes when a game very briefly suspends gravity so that players have a slightly lengthier window of time to execute on a jump. Put simply, Coyote Time allows you to make jumps in midair after you've stepped off a platform because it feels right. Think of it like bullet magnetism, except considerably less shit. It exists to mitigate the downsides of our shitty reaction times because we'd rather shout, "But I pressed the X button!" than admit that we might have done something wrong. This feature is not unique to Crash 4. Most platformers use Coyote Time, and like all features, there's a discussion to be had about just how lenient a game should be when giving you extra time to make a jump. So I tested Crash 4's Coyote Time to see just how lenient it is, and I came away from the exercise utterly shocked. Crash 4 is so lenient that you can jump as though you're standing on a solid platform whilst literally falling. Now you remember Crash 4, how I said I wouldn't compare you to the older games? Yeah, that's right, Friggy, you did! I lied. For the sake of comparison, I decided to boot up Crash Bandicoot Warped to see if it too had utilized this feature. As suspected, Warped also allows you to jump after you've stepped off a platform, and to my surprise, it's more lenient than I thought it would be. It's not this fucking lenient though. You may be wondering why I even brought this up. I mean, it is a fairly innocuous feature. Hell, I didn't even think to discuss it at first, but once I noticed just how much time this game grants you to make jumps you shouldn't have been able to make, I couldn't help but think about its implementation. The reason for that, I think, is because it's emblematic of what was probably a big priority for the developers, and that's accessibility. Accessibility is a scary word. I, for one, sometimes wake up in a cold sweat thinking about whether those ramps and lifts we've built in all our government buildings may better enable the handicapped to finally usurp control over the world and install wheels everywhere. In all seriousness, accessibility is a subject that I find a lot more difficult to broach lately, because the word at this point has taken on two different meanings. On one hand, there's unequivocally good accessibility, where games are simply made easier to play for people with disabilities. I think we can all agree that these options are great. Then there's the other kind of accessibility, where a game's design is changed to accommodate certain players in a way which compromises the experience for those who are looking for a challenge. Mandatory mid-boss checkpoints spring to mind, and no, I'm not lingering on this specific point for any reason at all. Difficulty sliders are a really easy way to satisfy all players, but platformers don't have this luxury. It's not possible to make it easier for a player to complete a jump they simply don't have the dexterity to pull off. It is possible to alter the fundamental movement mechanics of the game to make every single jump just a little bit easier, and that's what the extremely lenient Coyote Time in Crash 4 accomplishes. It certainly lowers the skill floor, but maybe too much. It's just so incredibly forgiving. However, it's important to remember that one can't automatically surmount a platforming challenge by simply being able to jump after stepping off a platform. You still need to make it to the other side. Crash Bandicoot 4 is a 3D platformer, but its level design bears far more similarities to its 2D forerunners than it does to its contemporaries. Even putting to one side that Crash Bandicoot 4 regularly employs perspective shifts, the game's levels are, with few exceptions, incredibly linear. You aren't dropped into an expansive world which you can explore at your leisure, nor are you ever presented with diverging paths. It's almost always a straight shot to the end. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that Crash 4 is more linear than Crash 2 and and 3, as those games occasionally forced players to choose between one of two paths forward. Crash 4 is not really a game about player choice. Beyond his ability to spin enemies in and out of existence like a black hole, except orange, and he sends them flying away rather than sucking them up. As mentioned previously, Crash himself doesn't exert any influence over the world, and so neither can the player. Their only choice is to surmount the game's obstacles. I suppose how you decide to surmount an obstacle counts as a decision, but remember that Crash doesn't have that many moves at his disposal, and so your choices are still quite limited. For instance, let's consider a pretty standard obstacle, a gap between two platforms. In getting from one side to the other, Crash only has 3 functionally distinct options. He can either jump, double jump, or slide jump. A single jump will usually give you all the distance you need. Unless you're trying to correct a failed jump, a double jump is only ever necessary if you need to jump a greater distance or reach an elevated platform. The slide jump is rarely called for. It's certainly a useful maneuver, but the game seldom necessitates its use. It should be becoming clear now that these aren't real choices, but that's kind of the point. Crash 4's core challenge doesn't come from making the right choice, but instead doing what you're expected to do correctly. And that challenge is facilitated by the levels and the obstacles contained within them. This linearity extends to the game's level progression too. Unlike Crash 2 and Warped, which allow players to choose between 5 levels situated within each hub, Crash 4 features a linear world map just like in Crash 1. Optional levels are scattered throughout each hub world, but the main levels must be tackled in the order that the game sets. In exchange for player freedom, Crash 4 offers players a string of carefully constructed obstacles to overcome, with each successive obstacle leveraging the knowledge and skills the game knows you've already obtained. In theory, this should contribute to the creation of a steady difficulty curve, and for the most part, the game's formidability increases with each new level. There are a few difficulty spikes, and some of them are more prominent than Mount Everest. Run at Bayou still haunts my fucking nightmares. Speaking of Run at Bayou, Crash 4 has some massive levels. Crash Landed and Toxic Tunnels are so large that a thorough playthrough devoid of any deaths may take you up to 10 minutes, a lengthy trek in any linear platformer, let alone a Crash Bandicoot game. I often found myself impressed by how long these levels were, and the fact that the challenges offered in each escalated so steadily. Despite having both more and larger levels than any other Crash game, Crash 4 is impressively diverse. Though levels in the same hub world feature similar visual motifs, they're all unique, both in their predominant look and structure. There are no copy-pasted levels to be found here, and world-specific hazards such as, but not limited to, totems which project fire or electrified Tesla coils are rarely reused in the levels which follow their introduction. New objects and hazards immediately replace the old ones. Frankly, I find that to be an impressive and commendable accomplishment. It ensures that each level is functionally distinct and that a sense of novelty persists right up until the end. Not only does every level feature several one-off enemies and hazards, but they also frequently contain brand new gameplay scenarios which often go unrepeated. For instance, in the Cortex Island hub, the first level predominantly uses turning gears themselves as platforms the players must traverse. The subsequent level features flat platforms affixed to the sides of gears. These platforms rotate back and forth, and some of them shoot out flames shortly after you set foot on them. The final level, Cortex Castle, tasks players with navigating laser grids and fast-moving platforms with spiked rims for good measure. All of this means that players can't become complacent if they expect to complete the game, as each subsequent level requires of the player differing levels of dexterity and spatial awareness. Crash 4's novelty is also propped up by unique gameplay scenarios. Some of these are returning Crash staples, such as running towards the camera and away from a moving object or enemy, and vehicle/riding atop a quadrupedal animal sections. Naturally, these sections are of varying quality. Crash's hallmark run towards the camera sections are excellent as always. They demand quick reaction times of the player by concealing a level's crates and obstacles for just long enough to make their appearance on screen a surprise. The persistent threat means that the player must keep moving. However, they're still afforded a small window of leniency which they can use to reach objects such as crates placed in slightly harder to reach locations. Most importantly, however, Crash's control scheme is left unchanged, meaning that no new mechanics are introduced or leveraged. Crash 4's vehicle sections aren't nearly as good, mainly because they do the exact opposite of all the things I just itemized. Putting to one side that the controls are plain wonky in these sections, an issue made worse by the constantly shifting camera screwing with your sense of direction, when you're required to ride atop Polar or his dinosaur equivalent, you cannot stop moving. The very slim lead you're afforded in the chase sections gives you an opportunity to fix your mistakes. If you can't stop moving forward, this isn't an option. You're just fucked and you have to either continue going or deliberately run into a wall so you can be sent back to the last checkpoint. It is worth noting that these sections are few and far between, and during your first playthrough, they'll probably serve as a good change of pace. Plus, they're a holdover from the old games, so the same issue very much applies to them too. Crash's signature bonus levels serve as a more robust and fair challenge. Appearing in every single level, Crash 4's bonus levels test your understanding of the crate system more so than your reaction times. They function more like a puzzle than a strict platforming challenge, so by comparison to every other unique gameplay scenario, they're the most distinct. There's still a lot to be discussed when it comes to these bonus levels, so we'll put them to one side for now. If there's one thing you should be taking away from all of this, it's that Crash 4 has some incredibly diverse levels and very strong level design in general. And we've still yet to touch on the brand new gameplay mechanic which enabled some of the game's most compelling challenges to arise. Crash Bandicoot 4's most notable new addition is the Quantum Masks, a set of power-ups which each grant Crash a slew of distinct abilities. Unlike an Aku Aku mask, which can be acquired or lost at any time, a Quantum Mask is provided to and taken away from the player at fixed locations within a level. Many obstacles are constructed specifically around their use, and apart from the Insanity Island levels, every single level in Crash Bandicoot 4 leverages the Quantum Masks. They are completely inextricable from this game. Lani Loli is the first Quantum Mask players will acquire. Lani Loli allows players to phase objects in and out of existence. His sections are generally structured around the player switching between different phases, I guess? Dimensions? I feel like dimensions is a strong word to describe popping one crate in and out of the material world. Schloop has already been taken, so let's call it plum boops. You switch between different plum boops to get through his sections. Akano grants players the ability to spin perpetually and break any obstacle in their path. TNT and Nitro crates will still deal damage, but reinforced crates will shatter with ease. Crash can still jump twice while spinning, but float a much greater distance than he could using the standard double jump. Akano stretches are often built around utilizing this enhanced jump effectively, with the game occasionally requiring players to switch in and out of the spin to navigate past hazards. Kapunawa slows down time, allowing players to navigate obstacles which would otherwise be moving too fast to traverse. Her powers also allow players to break Nitro crates without immediately being incinerated, provided they can move out of the way quickly enough. Ika Ika is the final Quantum Mask players will acquire. His power is inverting gravity, allowing Crash to walk on the ceiling if the ground is a little too deadly for his liking or vice versa. After jumping, Ika Ika can only invert gravity twice, which means you must choose the right moments to use his powers. The Quantum Masks are a great new gameplay pillar. They serve to greatly expand the maximum possible number of challenges the game can throw your way. Now that they're here, I can't picture any future Crash game either omitting the Quantum Masks or a comparable new gameplay mechanic. That said, I also can't help but feel like the developers didn't push this concept quite far enough. Crash 4's overall progression is as follows. Crash enters a new hub world with a new Quantum Mask. The following set of levels, which are usually capped off with a boss fight, will heavily utilize that one specific mask. The next hub world sees a mixture of masks used until the next Quantum Mask is acquired and the cycle begins anew. Though you will be required to use different masks within the same level, they're rarely employed one after the other. Typically, there'll be a chunk of the level dedicated to one mask, followed by a standard Crash platforming section, followed by another chunk dedicated to one mask. It's only once you reach Cortex Castle, the very last level of the game, that the full potential of the Quantum Mask becomes apparent, and the moment that the promise of this new gameplay hook is revealed, the game ends. Now that I've brought it up, please allow me to gush over Cortex Castle. It's one of the best levels in Crash 4. The final stretch of this masterclass in level design sees all four Quantum Masks used consecutively. Not only is the player required to grapple with each new challenge as it comes, but they also have to keep track of the attributes they're constantly gaining and losing. Couple that with a panning camera, which forces players to continue moving forward at a breakneck pace through an incredibly brutal play space, and you have one of the best sections in any Crash game to date. But then the game ends, 10 minutes later. Kinda feels like taking one bite out of a perfectly cooked filet mignon only to be swiftly punched in the face, dragged out of the restaurant, and tossed into the path of a semi-trailer carrying 4 dozen anvils. Oh, by the way, Crash Bandicoot 4 has several playable characters. Aside from Crash and Coco, who are functionally identical and playable in the same levels, Cortex, Dingodile, and an alternate reality version of Torna are all playable in Crash 4. Cortex, Dingodile, and Torna each sport their own movesets and stages, which typically conclude with a revamped Crash section based on the adjoining main level. While we're talking about additional content, Crash Bandicoot 4 also features something called Inverted Mode, a version of Mirror Mode which applies zany visual filters atop each level. This game is enormous. The breadth of content is kinda jaw-dropping, but as is often the case with an enormous amount of content, not everything received the same amount of time and care. There's no getting around the fact that Crash's levels and controls are fundamentally better than those of the other playable characters. Crash levels are the core of the game, so it does follow that they're the most refined and polished. The simplicity of Crash's controls also lends his gameplay a level of consistency and predictability the other playable characters don't have. Cortex, Dingodile, and Torna's controls regularly fuck up because their abilities aren't consistent. When you're playing as Torna, you often have to surrender control to the game itself, and since the game isn't you, sometimes what you intend to do isn't what the game does. This issue becomes incredibly pronounced when you need to use Torna's whip, as it's extremely temperamental, sometimes locking onto targets and sometimes not, while occasionally completely phasing through objects. Her whip will do things which you didn't want it to, and that can be incredibly annoying if it causes you to screw up your run. The same goes for Dingodile's vacuum/cannon, which can be used to pick up and launch TNT crates. It too is difficult to aim, in part because it's visually unclear where exactly Dingodile is launching said crates from. His vacuum is located slightly to his right, meaning that you aren't aiming from his center mass, and without any other visual cues to rely upon, you will regularly miscalculate your shots. A simple reticule or aimer would have almost certainly fixed this issue. Cortex is probably the strongest of the 3 new playable characters. His levels are far more puzzle-oriented, being built around his ability to transform enemies into either solid platforms or gelatinous platforms which he can use to bounce into the air. Unlike the Torna and Dingodile levels, which rarely feature 2D stretches, Cortex is often traversing 2D landscapes, and so issues involving aiming his gun are greatly diminished. But does it say something about the strength of a character's gameplay if it's markedly stronger in 2D when the game is a 3D platformer? Crash plays well regardless of the POV. I think it's applaudable that the developers tried to expand the game in this way, and more diverse modes of play is a good thing, but just how congruous these new characters are with Crash is unclear. The same issue applies with Inverted Mode, which on its face seems amazing until you realize that its gameplay modifications are sometimes categorically worse. Inverted Mode applies not only visual changes to every level, but sometimes major gameplay changes too. For instance, the dinosaur world plays the same and simply features a fun watercolor filter. The future world, on the other hand, is submerged in water and has shitty underwater physics you'll need to contend with, because 2D Sonic's fucking horrendous underwater levels were just so much fun! I suppose if you play Crash 4 once without any intent to fully complete it, this variety will probably seem welcome. In fact, the more that I think about it, if you play this game once and never touch it again after the credits roll, you'll probably come away thinking it was fairly good. But playing Crash 4 this way means missing out on everything it has to offer. Both good and painfully bad. When I decided that I was going to make this video, I tasked myself with playing Crash 4 to completion. I'm not much of a completionist, but I figured that trying to be would serve me well. My goal during this playthrough was to acquire every single gem, perfect run totem, platinum flashback tape relic, and as many time trial relics as I could stomach. I got close to completely achieving my goal. Only took fucking weeks. We got a lot to cover, so let's not waste time. Crash Bandicoot 4 becomes a vastly different game when you approach it with the intent to complete all of its content. It's not just that you'll need to play the game for longer or become more familiar with its mechanics, you're also required to approach each level purposefully and cautiously. Now, I'm not a clinical psychologist, but I'm just gonna power right ahead and talk about psychology anyway. I think that the mindset you have while playing a game can both significantly impact your experience and be significantly impacted by how the game prompts you to play, whether intentionally or not. And I think that Crash 4 is a little unsure of itself. With few exceptions, platformers don't tend to have scalable difficulty in the conventional sense. You know, things like reduced player health or smarter enemy AI. This makes a lot of sense when you think about it. After all, there's not much that can be done to make a bottomless pit easier to jump over. Many platformers instead employ optional objectives, the most common one being to collect objects scattered throughout a level. Sometimes progression is directly tied to the gathering of these objects, as is the case in collectathons like Banjo-Kazooie. Many 3D Mario games tie progression to the gathering of mandatory items like stars, with smaller optional stars or objectives being placed within the level for players to locate if they so choose. Crash Bandicoot's collectible objects, or perhaps more accurately smashable objects, are crates, which in turn are tethered to gems. It's quite a simple system. Breaking every crate in a level grants the player a gem. Boss stages excluded, every level has some crates, so every level presents an opportunity to obtain another gem. In Crash 1, players had to complete levels without dying to obtain gems, but the following games remove that requirement. It's not quite that simple, as colored gems worked a little differently, but for the sake of clarity, we'll put those to one side for now. What's important to understand is that the collecting of gems was and still is completely optional, as only crystals were ever required to complete Crash 2 and 3. Tying the full ending to the collection of gems was a great incentive, but they were still ultimately side content. Crash Bandicoot 4 greatly expands the number of gems players can obtain. Apart from the gem earned by breaking every crate, 3 gems are tied to collecting 40%, 60%, and 80% of all Wumpa fruit in a level. 1 gem is tethered to completing a level without dying more than 3 times, and the last new gem comes in the form of a hidden gem located in every level. Gem doesn't sound like a real word anymore. With this game having 38 platforming levels plus an equal number of inverted mode counterparts, that brings the total number of gems in Crash Bandicoot 4 to 456. Fucking hell. Now, simply giving the player a ton of things to find doesn't make a game more difficult in and of itself, at least not in any meaningful sense. Difficulty should generally be derived from a game's core mechanics and design, rather than how long it takes to gather every item. Does an optional objective make it harder to simply get through a level? Is tackling the optional challenge more difficult than ignoring it? When considering difficulty through this lens, Crash Bandicoot's crate system is genius. Breaking every crate in a Crash Bandicoot level is both a challenge in thoroughness and precise level navigation. To break every crate often means that players will be forced to make riskier jumps or plan out how they approach certain platforming challenges. For instance, many levels in Crash 4 will see crates positioned between stable platforms and above bottomless pits. As far as hard things go, this isn't as much of a step up as painting the roof of the Sistine Chapel after drawing your first stick figure, but it's certainly tougher. Such a challenge may be further enhanced by an inconveniently positioned TNT or Nitro crate. Breaking them may also require precise timing from the player due to other level hazards or enemies. Sometimes you need to break every crate, including less accessible crates, while in motion. And remember, if you're trying to get a perfect run totem, you can't afford to screw up any of these jumps, and so what would normally be a rudimentary task becomes just a hair more sweat-inducing. In Crash 4, the quantum masks serve to further elevate the challenge. Crates may be placed in locations which require the player to really leverage the power of whichever quantum mask Crash is wearing. That may mean switching between different plum boops extremely quickly while wearing Lani Loli, or perfectly timing when to use Kapunawa's ability to slow down time to reach an elevated platform. Again, it's not that complicated, but a little goes a long way, especially if these tricks are being employed dozens of times within one level. In the bonus levels and flashback tapes, the true brilliance of the crate system becomes starkly apparent. I mentioned before that these levels are a lot more like puzzles in that what they demand of the player is not strictly dexterity, but thoughtful decision making. Breaking every crate in a bonus level often means breaking them in the right order, as platforms may become inaccessible otherwise. For instance, it's not uncommon for Nitro crates to be placed throughout a level near other crates which must be used to get between platforms. And so breaking a Nitro crate, or triggering the explosion of all Nitro crates in a level, may no longer make certain platforms accessible. I probably don't need to tell you this sometimes means that bonus levels will devolve into a game of trial and error, which would be absolutely infuriating if this cost the player several lives. However, because bonus levels can be tackled as many times as a player wishes without consequence, it's not a big deal, and it encourages you to think outside the box, pun very much intended. The flashback tapes push this concept to the next level, employing some incredibly clever level design which fully utilizes the diversity of the Crash crate system in an environment which is broadly forgiving of the player player's mistakes. This all sounds great, doesn't it? I mean, what an elegant way to create scalable difficulty in a game, especially considering that all of its strengths are derived from the core gameplay mechanics. It'd be a shame if some of these crates were placed in locations which the player couldn't see or otherwise wouldn't think to search. Be a real fucking shame, wouldn't it? The genius of the crate system, when implemented well, is that players who seek to break them all are forced to confront more challenging tests in the process. The main thing that you're doing, getting to the end of the level, becomes inherently harder. One might argue that a level can be made harder by hiding crates beyond the fucking view of the camera, but if I were met with such a claim, I would very calmly disagree. Crash 4 has a lot of hidden crates. I don't like them. They make me very sad. I cannot fucking believe some of the places these crates were located. From ledges 15 feet above the floor to the fucking background elements of a stage, wherever you think the game wouldn't have the gall to hide a crate, it will. When you eventually find them, or look up a walkthrough to preserve your sanity, you will not feel accomplished. It's more likely that you'll stand up, pace around whichever room you find yourself in, stare at the ceiling, and scream, "How was I supposed to know it was there?" If you consider this to be an overreaction, I don't think you quite understand the abject misery that comes from reaching the end of a level, believing you smashed every crate on your 17th attempt to do so without dying, only to learn that you missed one fucking hidden crate, and that you'll have to complete the level all over again! Don't even get me started on the hidden gems. Well, I guess I've started on them, haven't I? Run It fucking Bayou contains one of the most egregious hidden gems in the entire game. You'll have to find and spin a hidden metal crate, backtrack through an innocuous path you would never think twice about, somehow know that the metal crate you just spun created new platforms hidden beyond view to the right, jump onto that platform, and get the gem. This may come as a surprise to you, but I am not Odin. I didn't sacrifice one of my eyes so that I could see collectible items situated beyond the view of cameras in platforming video games. That was my mistake, I guess. There are nearly 80 hidden gems in this game, and for every gem to be found in a reasonable location, there's one placed beneath a falling platform, or amongst the background elements, or beyond the view of the camera. Worse yet, a handful of hidden gems are impossible to obtain without dying, meaning that in some levels, you can't acquire perfect run totems and hidden gems in the same run. This probably explains why you don't need to nab them to get a perfect run totem, but I can't help but feel this is a stupid decision. First, it is unreasonable to expect players to know that they'll have to purposefully trigger a fail state to obtain collectible items. Second, once you come to realize that getting even a few gems may require you to deliberately get Crash killed, you'll develop two distinct approaches to playing the game: overly cautious and downright flippant. If you're going for 100% completion, by the time you reach the fourth hub world, you'll be scouring every inch of every level in search of these objects, and you'll still probably miss a few because you can't look for what you don't know what to look for. Every trick the game pulls will be yet another trick you'll have to consider when playing through each successive stage, until by the end of the game you've basically got no way of knowing where to go or what to look for by way of clues. As far as I'm concerned, that's not a, for lack of a better word, fun way to engage with a video game. Well, that just means you suck at the game. Yeah, I guess it is my fault that I didn't see something. Fuck me, right? Not seeing something. What a fucking idiot I am. If I'm being extremely charitable, I guess these hidden crates and gems increase the game's replay value, but I question how valuable that really is when this is how it was facilitated. There's no getting around the fact that with few exceptions, these attempts to make the game more difficult don't utilize the core gameplay mechanics of Crash 4. They don't make the platforming intrinsically tougher. Instead, they penalize you for simply not seeing something that you weren't looking for. It's like that video of the gorilla walking around in the background, except it's an entire game, and not noticing the gorilla results in you getting kicked square in the testicles. I had to defer to walkthroughs far more frequently than I would have liked to when collecting perfect run totems, which is something I never really had to do in previous Crash games, but even if it were a component of the older games, that doesn't make this design choice any less egregious. But wait, there's fucking more! Time trials are perhaps the most significant piece of side content in Crash 4, and completing them affords you the game's many relics. For the sake of those unfamiliar with how time trials work in Crash 4, here is an incredibly brief summary. Your objective is to reach the end of the level as quickly as possible, obviously, but you can momentarily freeze the timer by smashing numbered crates. The numbers displayed on the crate correspond with the number of seconds they shave off your time. Pretty straightforward. Crash 4 has several tiers of relics separated by completion time, with the platinum relics being the highest tiered of them all. There are special toys for Bob relics, which are the most difficult ones to get, but as far as I'm aware, you don't need to get those to achieve the game's maximum level of completion. I came into this playthrough intent on collecting all the platinum relics, but after 30 minutes of playing the time trials, I abandoned this goal because achieving it probably would have caused me to develop carpal tunnel syndrome. I am only half joking. I'm not sure how I feel about purposefully developed content in a video game requiring speedrun tactics like pressing the same two buttons repeatedly in a precise order, but I do know how I feel about getting a cramp in my hand while playing a video game. I managed to push through the concentrated dose of sheer agony that was getting all the gems and perfect run totems, but 30 minutes into my time trial rush, I knew that I wasn't going to get all the platinum relics no matter how hard I tried or how long I played. There is only one viable method of obtaining them, and that is to sloop or slide spin perpetually, which means pressing the circle and square button over and over and over again. So in that sense, I guess the time trials are hard. Once you start going for and obtaining platinum relics, you are engaging with Crash 4 at the highest level of play, and I would certainly commend anybody who was able to collect them all, but I don't think that I'm even physically capable of doing so, and I'm not sure how I feel about that in terms of what it says about the game. By now, you may be piecing together that Crash Bandicoot 4 has an exorbitant number of collectibles, and much like the caveman probably began to ponder whether it was a good idea to try and walk across thin air to reach the other side of the chasm, there comes a point while playing this game when you start to wonder whether it's even worth pursuing 100% completion. Even without taking inverted mode into account, Crash 4 has the most optional content of all the games in the series, but the quality of all that content is questionable. I'm happy to say that it's mostly good, but when it's not, playing Crash 4 becomes an exercise in patience and endurance rather than skill. Yet despite everything I just outlined, Crash 4 doesn't even fully commit to its ball-busting difficulty. Whether major or minor, the concessions Crash 4 makes for casual players are evident, and most of them can't even be turned off. Crash 4 has two main modes of play, Modern or Classic. In Modern mode, there are no lives, meaning that players cannot hit a game over screen. In Classic mode, there are lives, and losing all of them will send the player back to the very beginning of a level. Options are great, so that's great, but Crash 4 is so exceedingly generous with Wumpa Fruit that Classic mode might as well not be. I never ran out of lives. I never saw a game over screen. I got close during my first playthrough, but that only happened when I reached Cortex Castle, the very last level of the game. Crash 4 has mid-boss checkpoints, which you can't turn off. Several bosses have more than one checkpoint too. If these checkpoints could be disabled, some of the game's bosses, particularly Cortex and Embryo, might have proven to be a real challenge. As they are though, no boss is all that hard to beat. If you die too many times in a level, you'll spawn with a protective Aku Aku mask. If you die several more times after that, you'll spawn with two Aku Aku masks. You can't disable this feature either. Here's the most perplexing one. If you die too many times before reaching certain checkpoints, an additional checkpoint will spawn halfway between them. You can't turn this off. I have no idea why these weren't optional or why they weren't relegated to the game's modern mode. There is no reason why these should be a component of every person's game rather than the games of those who choose to turn on these options. I wonder what that tells us. Crash 4 is a game which simultaneously attempts to accommodate players of lower skill by implementing numerous safety nets, many of which are mandatory, and high skill players by placing hundreds of collectibles between them and maximum completion. Seems to me like Crash 4 is torn between worlds. It doesn't want to be so hardcore that it becomes inaccessible, but much of its audience is looking for such an experience. I imagine this is a pretty common dilemma for developers to face, and it probably explains why so many games have a low skill floor and a high skill ceiling. challenging. When done well, the results can be great. When done well, Crash 4 is accessible. I'm sure many people found the game to be hard, but it is undoubtedly accessible. It's a simple game with simple mechanics and a simple design. Well, simple doesn't sound like a word anymore either. Not only is Crash 4 a straightforward game, but its safety nets greatly ease its challenges. Never being sent back to the start of a level reduces the number of times a player will have to surmount an obstacle before they can continue making progress, and that's just one of many safety nets. There is a discussion to be had about the influence these decisions have on the playthroughs of high skill players, but the fact that they don't even factor into one's experience when going for perfect run totems or platinum relics certainly makes them far less egregious additions than they otherwise might have been. But on the other hand, simply tasking the player with completing an insane number of optional objectives and padding out the time that takes by scattering difficult to find objects throughout the game doesn't create a high skill ceiling, but rather a high patience floor, one which I struggled to stand upon. I do love this game though. Crash Bandicoot 4 is a nifty little platformer which expands upon the core foundations of the original games to facilitate brand new gameplay experiences. It's a really fun blast from the past, and perhaps most importantly, Crash Bandicoot 4 is largely uncompromising in its desire to recapture the essence of the old games. Bar the amazing visuals, Crash Bandicoot 4 doesn't feel incongruous with the original PlayStation trilogy. That's quite an accomplishment, considering that Crash Bandicoot hasn't felt like a cohesive franchise since Crash Team Racing. However, when I think about what I got from Crash Bandicoot 4, absolute contentment does not come to mind. Don't get me wrong, I'm incredibly glad this game exists, but I wouldn't want it to end here. Crash Bandicoot 5 seems inevitable, and Crash 4 will probably serve as a great launchpad for future games with brand new characters, stories, and gameplay elements. But regarding the game's difficulty, if I were forced to describe it as briefly as possible without being downright reductive, I would say that Crash Bandicoot 4 is quite easy if you want it to be, but also painfully difficult if you want it to be. That sounds like an excellent balance on its face, but to say that would be to completely omit all nuance from the discussion, because it's not quite that simple, nor does that statement address the game's flaws in any meaningful way. Crash 4 compromises on its promise of difficulty while also being hard in ways which are inarguably cheap. You can't turn off the game's mid-boss checkpoints, Aku Aku crutches, or incredibly forgiving coyote time. But conversely, you'll feel like you've been unfairly fucked over when you reach the end of a level, only to discover that you missed a crate that was hidden behind a fucking tree. The game offers a difficult experience for those who seek it, but it's also an experience which tests your patience more than your reflexes. Unfortunately, I think part of the reason why that's the case is because most of the other methods the developers had to increase Crash 4's difficulty would have made the game inherently harder for all players, regardless of whether one was going for 100% completion or not. I refer to the types of platforming challenges which one can't circumvent, the ones the game is shy to implement for fear of alienating players. If the whole game was like the last stretch of Cortex Castle, not strictly in doing exactly what that level does, but more so being unafraid to really push players to the limit, Crash 4 would have been an insane experience suitable only for the most hardcore platforming gamers. Perhaps one which wouldn't call for gimmicks like hidden crates. I realize that's probably not financially viable, but since when have I ever considered that a justification? Instead, the game's hardest challenges are strictly relegated to the path of the Completionist, but in the form of an obscene number of optional tasks and hidden objects so well concealed that barely anybody is going to be able to find them all without defaulting to walkthroughs at least once, if not several more times than that, which kind of deflates the sense of accomplishment such tasks are supposed to evoke. But if you play this game once, and casually, most of these issues won't dampen your experience, and that is an accomplishment in and of itself. Crash Bandicoot 4 is hard, sometimes in ways which are frustrating, but what really matters is that Crash Bandicoot 4 is worth playing. It looks and sounds amazing, it's packed full of content, and it's damn good fun. But would I ever recommend going for maximum completion? Yeah, if you're the type to get a kick out of injecting sulfuric acid into your bloodstream. You're still here. Well, I suppose that means you really enjoyed this video. That, or you found it so abysmally bad that you were unable to close the tab because you were too busy laughing at me. For the sake of my brittle ego, I'm gonna go ahead and assume that you enjoyed the video. If you'd like to help me continue working on creative projects, consider supporting me on Patreon. Aside from long-form analysis videos like this one, I'm also working on some original content of my own, including comics, cartoons, and short stories. Thanks for sticking around.